Title for my message today is titled The Irking Idolatry. So, is it possible for a person or object to become so offensive or irritating to us that this festers and crowds God out of our central focus, thus bringing about an idol? Primary candidate, which I'll talk a little more on today, is Jonah. And he provides a prime example of someone so obsessed with contempt and hostility for a group of people that God's overall plan or perspective didn't matter as much as his own desire for vengeance. So let's first turn to Exodus chapter 20 and verse 3, and we will have the first commandment. Exodus chapter 20, verse 3. I want to read from two different Bibles, King James and New Living Translation. King James Bible says, real simple, you shall have no other gods before me. I like the way the NLT says it. You must not have any other God but me. So the first of the 10 commandments, we were told that any other gods, any other things that we worship or serve or emulate are going to be in opposition to our true God. God does not allow us to have anything else as dominant focusing in our lives. Idolatry, not adultery, I-D-O-L, idol, is a very broad topic, and we are all aware that there are many ways in which it can occur. Or a person can create a god in his own mind out of something material, such as a car or a house. Could be anything. We know that adultery can be extended even further to include placing too much emphasis on a career or possibly a marriage or other human relationships. And these things certainly aren't wrong in doing them, but they can be taken to the point that God is pushed out of our worldview. This application is a very subtle form of idolatry, and it is something that I have labeled as irking idolatry. It's just irking. Irking adultery is when we allow an irritating or an offensive person, situation, or circumstance to occupy our vision to the point that God is squeezed out of the picture. Within this context, I'm using the word irk or irritant to describe something that evokes a negative reaction, one that makes us see red. There's a wide range here, but the common element is that it's a reaction caused by something that is contrary to our perspective with God. I think you will agree with me that this world has many things that are irritating and which offend our sensibilities. God's spirit and the spirit of this world are diametrically opposed, and our hearts and minds are frequently the battlegrounds. Our judgment, our comparison of this situation with regards to God's law may indeed be correct, but there are times there comes a point when these things take up so much of our focus that we lose sight of God. These situations, these irking irritants, become idolatry when we see them more clearly than when we see God, and when we begin responding to them more than we are responding to God. So if you would, let's turn to Jonah, chapter 3, and let's consider Jonah's reaction and look at how his assessment of the situation is so different from God's. This is after God had already told Jonah to go to Nineveh once, and Jonah tried to run away. And God had to ever so gently convince Jonah that he was going the wrong way. So Jonah chapter 3, and I'm going to read verses 1 through 5. Now the word of the Lord came to Jonah the second time, saying, Arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and preach to it the message that I tell you. Verse 3. So Jonah arose and went to Nineveh according to the word of the Lord. Now Nineveh was an exceedingly great city, a 3-day journey in extent. And Jonah began to enter the city on the first day's walk. Then he cried and said, "Yet 40 days, and Nineveh shall be overthrown." In verse 5, so the people of Nineveh believed God and proclaimed a fast and put on sackcloth from the greatest to the least of them. One of the things I found interesting was that even the animals fasted. Jonah chapter 3, verse 10, just down a little bit. Then God saw their works, that they turned from their evil way, and God relented. He changed his mind from the disaster that he had said he would bring upon them, and he did not do it. So Jonah chapter 4, starting in verse 1, I'm going to read verses 1 through 3. Here's Jonah, verse 1. But it displeased Jonah exceedingly, and he became angry. So he prayed to the Lord and said, Lord, was this not what I said when I was still in my own country? Verse 3, therefore I fled previously to Tarshish, for I knew that you are a gracious and merciful God, slow to anger and abundant in loving kindness, one who relents from doing harm. Therefore, Lord, please take my life from me, for it is better for me to die than to live. And then you can see what happens in verse 8 and 9. Chapter 4, verse 8. And it happened when the sun arose that God prepared of the Heman east wind, and the sun beat on Jonah's head, to that he grew faint. Then wished for death for himself, and he said, is it better for me to die than to live? And God said to Jonah, verse 9, it is right for you to be angry about the plant. And he said, it is right for me to be angry even to death. After God finally convinced Jonah to do the job that God had given to him, Jonah preached to the Ninevites and told them that their city would be destroyed. That's, of course, early chapter. It says that Jonah was given this task because of the wickedness of the city. So Jonah finally gave them their warning as God had instructed him, and he went out of the city and sat down and waited for the destruction of the city. But notice his reaction, Jonah's reaction, when God did not destroy the city. And that's Jonah chapter 4 and verse 1. It says it displeased Jonah exceedingly, and he was very angry. It appears that he had grown up equivalent of a temper tantrum because things did not turn out the way he thought, Jonah thought, that they would be, or the way he thought that they should be. He was angry at the salvation that God was working out for the city. This is an interesting example because Jonah knew ahead of time what God thought about Nineveh and what God was planning to do. Even though Jonah heard directly from God, God was still not at the center of Jonah's view. There are many other issues and other concerns that are greater and more important to him than what God was working out. At the beginning of the book, Jonah was more interested in running from God's work than submitting to it. Even after he grudgingly obeyed, he threw a fit because God did not deal with the people of Nineveh the way Jonah thought that God should. 3 times Jonah concluded that he would rather die if he could not have his own way. His own view and outlook was more real to him than God's perspective and what God was working out. Jonah was a mere mortal, was not in a position to see all that God could see, and yet Jonah still deemed his own judgment to be more correct than God's. He focused more on the situation with Nineveh, and later with the little plant that he did on God and God's sovereign will. And thus he committed this subtle form of adultery. Like Jonah, we simply do not have the vantage point that God does. Our Christian life is the means by which God forms us into his image, and what God is most interested in is how we handle those relationships within our lives, our relationship with him and our relationship with our neighbor. Every time there is friction Every time there is an irking irritant, large or small, there is the potential for our human nature to rise up and for God to be pushed into the background. This is not idolatry in the sense of worship, but it is idolatry in terms of letting something become larger and more real than God.